So for a lot of people, I guess still most people these days who are set on the fact that all of this is just in your head and that there's no separation or expansion that could be possible, how would you describe to them the objective evidence that you've seen? Because then for most people it will be anecdotal evidence doesn't count, etc. And that's unfortunately you see a lot of that. So how would you describe these objective experiences that you've had that have evidenced you that they are objectively occurring?
Well, first off, I think skeptics often do a bit of a sleight of hand with the word anecdotal. An anecdote generally refers to something that's just a story that's repeated and has no real validity to it. I think there's a difference between an anecdote and a case study, or an experience that has been verified and documented, for example. I don't think those are the same things as an anecdote. So that's important to highlight first of all, because something like an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience, there's actually no way really to study the experience accurately without using the accounts of individuals. You have to take an account.
That's right. Yeah.
There is no other way to do it other than maybe fMRI scans or whatever. But that doesn't tell you.
You can't take a camera out of its body to record what's going on. Yeah. All you've got is the after account. That's true. And that's something I've thought of.
So if we take that argument seriously, then it basically just discounts the entire area of study or research. We might as well abandon psychology because you have to talk to people to get feedback. So I think we have to highlight the difference between a prospective study, for example. We have to differentiate between case studies. We have to identify the difference between something that's been recorded and verified and all of that kind of thing. So having made that point, the cases in my life that I'm interested in most are the cases where there has been someone or multiple people who have verified what I experienced. And that's verified what I've experienced prior to actually checking the information and seeing if it's correct. So that's the first part. The second part is actually taking part in laboratory studies. So I don't think case studies on their own or verified cases stand on their own, but I think we do have to then add in the element of doing research in the laboratory. So that's why I took part in experiments with Rupert Sheldrake, and then with Dean Radin, and then most recently with the Ryan Research Centre, where we did I think it was 14-week study using remote perception. So I had to describe blind targets that were being selected randomly by someone I didn't even know on the other side of the planet. So they were doing that in the US and I was in Estonia.
That's the likes
and I had
of,
to send off.
Is that a similar thing to the likes of Joseph McMonigal, people like that?
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. So basically, what you get at the end of the day is a data set of information about different targets, which I think is essentially the same mechanisms that you experience in an out-of-body experience, the veridical elements, as they call them in the field of near-death studies. So it's basically objective perceptions. So in a study, in a sort of laboratory context or a controlled context, you have to kind of strip down these things to particular psychic abilities, so non-local perception or telepathy or precognition or whatever it might be, micro PK, micro psychokinesis, that means. So you have to strip everything down, and then you have to analyze that all in terms of statistical data, and then that's later analyzed. So that's really how how you back up the more spontaneous experiences, the experiences like I mentioned, where I'll be out of body, I'll perceive something accurately, then I'll describe it to someone, then we'll check the data, and all that will be recorded.
Yeah.
Those experiences are peak experiences. They don't happen every day, but when they do, they're hugely significant.
That's
and
right.
then those are the complementary experiences, if you like, to the laboratory research.
I mean, that's something that
That's
something that I think of a lot. Is you know, if for example, someone says there's no such thing as a blue cow, it only takes one person to see a blue cow, and that theory is completely out the window. And I think it's similar with this sort of experience. People can, you know, say it's all nonsense, but it only takes one experience to completely change what we understand about how life works. But people seem to ignore it. And if you know, studies such as the ones that you've just mentioned there have been done and have given back strong evidence that this is the case, why do you think then that there's still so many people who are not taking it seriously? Because surely this should be a paradigm shifting thing.
There's a combination of reasons. I think one of the strongest reasons is academic stigma. I think that people feel like they're going to be made to feel foolish or stupid or woo-woo is the favourite word of the skeptic community.
I hate that term. I hate that and James Randi and his bloody $1 Million Challenge all the time.
Well, we can get to James Randi.
Yeah.
I've met him, so
I don't have a problem with him. It's just his bloody challenge.
Usually when I encounter the average skeptic, and now I'm talking about the average person who's skeptical of these kinds of things, they're utterly ignorant of any of the research and haven't really, well, they haven't at all looked at any of it. They just go by, they saw a TV show like The Enemies of Reason by Richard Dawkins. And that's where they've got their viewpoint from, which is shocking because, you know, taking any viewpoint from seeing a couple of bad documentaries or even good documentaries, you know, is pretty terrible. I mean,
the first thing about skepticism, first of all, I don't class it as skepticism. I class it as cynicism, or even that's too good a word. But skepticism surely is being able to see an argument from both sides and drawing conclusions based on the weight.
Well, I would say skepticism is just needing evidence before you take on a particular viewpoint or idea, and I think that's valid, and I think a lot of the skeptical arguments are valid. A lot of their arguments, I should say, are more valid than most of the New Age arguments. So where I you know, and I think even James Randi's exposure of the evangelical preacher Peter Popoff, and stuff like that. I mean, that's obviously a good thing, but the thing is, you know, that happened, I believe, in the 1980s. You know, what has Randi really done since? You know, and so he's been focusing on parapsychologists and people like that, and I think that's really unfortunate because it's really undermined the entire field. And skeptics will often say, oh, well, you know, if these things are real, why doesn't blah blah go and do a study, or, you know, or do a, you know, and the thing is, well, because the field is almost penniless and almost reduced to nothing because of the onslaught of negative press and negative opinions put forward by the skeptics.
Any, you know, prominent scientist that actually takes the time to investigate this stuff is risking, sorry, my dog's whining in the background, is risking complete public ridicule if they even attempt, because of these kind of folks out there. So what sort of intelligent person would do that?
So that brings it back to what I was saying at the moment when you said at the beginning the first problem is sort of academic stigma. So for any kind of scientist to openly say that they're interested or that they think that these things are real, they have to brave being ridiculed, and
potentially
they
losing
have
their
to brave.
career.
Exactly, yeah. Even
Such a
though
shame.
the evidence for psi, for some form of psi, is extremely strong. It's stronger than many other areas of science. So, and that is a fact. The data is there. Anyone can go and look at it. You know, there's information from multiple organizations. There's replicated studies in many areas. So there can always be the argument of different interpretations, but you know, there's creationists who argue that evolution isn't real. You know, there's always going to be people who will, you know, turn around and be skeptical and say, oh, this isn't a reality because of their particular ideological viewpoint.
The Earth
But
isn't round.
but I like Bertrand Russell's
Yes.
phrase where he said, ask only what are the facts. and that's kind of what I get down to. I'm kind of like, what's the data? Let's look at the data from parapsychology. Let's look at the data from these different areas, and what does it show? And I think that when you do that, you get consistent results that demonstrate that there's a small but real effect, real psychic effect. And I think that psychic effect is the basis of out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, premonitions, all of these different areas that people experience on a day-to-day level.
And I think it's such a shame that, you know, people feel inclined to kind of ignore this area for fear of ridicule, because it could, as we say, potentially shift the human entire understanding of life and how it works. But I suppose, you know, you have to give it to James Randi. He's been bloody successful. Everyone knows him. So for that, good on him, in a way.
Yeah, he's definitely been successful, but he's saying in a way what the academic mainstream want to hear. I mean, it's not. I mean, if he was on the other side of the coin, I don't think he would have been as successful. I mean, the thing is, it's, for example, if I decided to become a skeptic tomorrow and I abandoned everything that I've investigated and looked into, and I became a skeptic who suddenly was talking against all of this stuff, I would suddenly be invited to just about every university there is around, you
and
know,
every online forum and everything else.
Yeah, I would suddenly have speaking engagements everywhere, just pretty much like what happened to Susan Blackmore. You know, she was briefly a parapsychologist, and you know, now she's invited all over the world to talk about how she found nothing and how it's all not true. If people are interested in my take on Susan Blackmore, then I've written quite an in-depth article as a response to my debate with her, which is on my website. I went into a lot of detail and put a lot of references in there to sort of analyse her arguments, and it's very interesting how the same person gets one conclusion and they'll be taken seriously, and the very same person has a different conclusion and they won't, which shows that it's not about the person and it's not about the levels of research that they're able to do. It's simply about the conclusions that they make. If you make an unpopular conclusion, then it's, you know, you're not going to be taken seriously whether your research is completely tight or not.
A good example of that, I think, is Charles Tart and his Miss Z experiment, or as the Americans say, Miss Z, because that's one that's often dismissed as completely unscientific, with every possibility that she cheated, wasn't it?
Well, I'm not a fan of the Miss Z experiment myself. I mean, I do think there were some major flaws in that experiment, but what I would say is it certainly wasn't a result against out-of-body experiences or psi functioning. There were problems with the design of the experiment, for sure, But there were problems with many designs in that era.
Yeah.
It wasn't used to parapsychology, but there certainly were problems with the design. But the point is it was still a positive result. So what I would say is at best you can say it's a neutral case, because we don't. But the thing is, since then, there's been much better controlled research. I mean, the remote viewing research, for example, is much more consistent and compelling over a longer period of time. So we also have Patricio Tresoldi's research, who I just wrote a paper with, comparing spontaneous and hypnotically induced out-of-body experiences. We just published it to the internet, so that's been reviewed by various scientists in the field, so it's peer reviewed. It will be published in a journal at some point soon. But so that's an example of how, again, the missaid case is brought up a lot, and it's from decades ago.
Yeah.
Whereas we now have more recent research, both in non-local perception of some form like remote viewing. We now have the out-of-body experience research, which also got positive, statistically significant results. We don't have many studies, but we do have studies. I mean, with remote viewing, we do have a lot of studies. I mean, remote viewing is probably the best evidence for perceiving things beyond the normal senses, extrasensory perception. So I think it's very problematic, really, to sort of ignore all of that, and that's essentially what the skeptics do. But I think scientists can't be blamed for that, because it's very unusual to have such a powerful sort of lobbying board. Really, the skeptics are like this sort of activist, sort of lobbyists who just put a lot of effort into undermining anything to do with psychic abilities or alternative viewpoints on consciousness.
Anything against what they term rational thinking.
Yeah, I'm not really sure why everything has to be local, i.e. perceptions and information has to be local in order for it to be rational. Why couldn't information come from a non-local source? This is all we're really talking about. So I don't know why that makes everything completely irrational. And considering you have a whole body of science, isn't that the very definition of the rational approach to understanding something?
You would have thought so.